Good afternoon. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that the place in which we work and study is situated within the traditional unceded lands of the Ganegaga or Mohawk peoples, part of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. There is also a strong historic presence of Anishinaabe peoples in what is now known as the Greater Montreal area, or Jejoke. And Montreal has long been and continues to be a gathering place for many First Peoples from all directions. We honor and thank the traditional custodians of this land and strive to work for the success of future generations. On behalf of the Vanier College English Department, I would like to welcome you to Whose Freedom? Art, Text, and Expression in the Public Domain, our 10th annual symposium. During this three-day event, we are presenting a wide variety of speakers, performers, activists, and writers, exploring the impact of language and voice. We will also be asking tough questions such as whose voice deserves to be listened to and amplified? What are the consequences of pushing aside those stories we don't want to hear? And how can language be a tool to empower or to imprison? My name is Alan Wong. I'm a professor in the English department, and this event would not be possible without the support of numerous collaborators. Thus, the symposium organizing committee would like to thank the Faculty of General Education, the Faculty of Art, Business, and Social Science, Vanier's Director General and Academic Dean, Vanier's Communication Office, the Vanier College English Department, the Psi Office, Vanier's Indigenous Studies Program, Student Services, VTV, and our many speakers and performers, and of course you, our wonderful audience. Before I introduce the next speakers, I kindly ask that you refrain from recording the session out of respect for our guests. We will be recording this particular session. It's recording right now. And this recording will be provided to the Vanier community sometime next week after it's been uploaded to VTV. Finally, there will be time for a question and answer after the talk, the roundtable. If you're interested in learning more from our guests, those of you who want to participate in the Q&A, there is a button at the bottom of your screen, of your Zoom screen. If you toggle, you'll see a Q&A box or icon there that you can click and type in your questions. Please don't type them into the chat. Okay, so this particular presentation is a roundtable discussion on representation and appropriation in art, literature, and media called Reflecting Authenticity. Many children seek out role models from whom they can draw inspiration to envision the possibilities of what they can achieve for their respective futures. To find such figures, they often turn to the arts and mass media, wherein they can discover characters, both real and fictional, whom young people might see as reflective of their experiences and identities. However, making such discoveries is much more of a challenge for those in the West who belong to communities that the majority population have long marginalized based on race, gender, socioeconomic status, sexuality, religion, and/or ability, with a stark lack of representation of minoritized peoples in literature as well as on stage and screen, leaving the impression that they do not even exist. Adding insult to injury, there are even frequent instances when members of the more privileged social, economic, and political classes perform the roles or portray the experiences of the disenfranchised to whom the elites have no connection, effectively appropriating and exploiting other people's lives without the slightest hint of authenticity, defending their right to do so in the name of quote-unquote freedom of expression. The following roundtable has been organized to address these issues of representation, appropriation, and authenticity with a variety of backgrounds, perspectives, and lived experiences reflected by the participants in our discussion today. So I'm going to now introduce our panelists / roundtablists, I don't know what you call it, participants. So first, Shaista Latif is a queer Afghan working class artist, facilitator, and consultant. Her works and collaborations have been presented by Why Not Theatre, Kofler Center for the Arts, Mercer Union, Blackwood Gallery, the AGO, and festivals such as Summer Works, Progress, and 7A * 11D. In 2020, Latif toured her critically acclaimed show, The Archivist, co-produced by Ontario Presents and Why Not Theatre. She's a published playwright and voiced the character Soraya in the Oscar-nominated animated film The Breadwinner. Her upcoming exhibit, How I Learned to Serve Tea, is currently being presented at the Art Gallery of Guelph in the show Collective Offerings, curated by Mitra Fakrashafri and Vince Rosario. Latif's works explore the politics of inclusion and class. You can follow her on Instagram at Shaista Latif Makes. Courtney Montour is a Gane Gaga filmmaker from Ganawage whose works explore issues of Indigenous identity. Her recent documentary, Married 2 Acts Early, I Am Indian Again, is currently screening at film festivals internationally and won an award, I believe, recently too, if I'm not mistaken. So congratulations on that. Produced by the National Film Board of Canada, the film shares the powerful story of Married 2 Acts Early, who fought for more than 2 decades to challenge sex discrimination against First Nations women in Canada's Indian Act and became a key figure in Canada's women's rights movement. Eli Tarek El Beshalani Lynch is a queer Arab poet living in Jojage, unceded Ganagaga territory. Their work has appeared in the Best Canadian Poetry 2018 anthology, Guts, Carte Blanche, the Shade Journal, the New Quarterly, Arc Poetry Magazine, and elsewhere. They were longlisted for the CBC Poetry Prize in 2019. You can find them on Instagram and Twitter at the only Eli Tarek. Their book, Not Body, was published by Metatron Press in 2020, and their upcoming book, The Good Arabs, was published by Menominee Press in September 2021. They are an editor at Smoke and Mold and the nonfiction editor at The Puritan. And finally, Blossom Tom is a poet, editor, and proofreader. Her poems document Black experiences, play with form, and occasionally include embedded text. Her poetry has appeared during art collaborations and in literary magazines and anthologies, including Poetic Notions, A Weaving of Poetry and Visual Arts, Cola, a Black literary magazine, and Montreal Sirai. Blossom emigrated with her family from Guyana to Southern Ontario, where she was raised. Blossom holds an MFA in creative writing from National University and an honors BA in religious studies from McMaster University. So I'd like to welcome all of our roundtable participants. So I'm going to begin with a reflection question. So looking back on your childhood or youth, so how much did you think about seeing yourself represented in the arts and media when you were a child or a teenager? So I'm going to start with Blossom since she's unmuted right now. So why don't you begin?
Okay, thank you for including me in this event. So when I was a child or a teenager, that was about 40 years ago, 40 to 50 years ago. So there wasn't really a lot of representation about people like, people who looked like me. And I'm thinking about this. And we only had cartoons on Saturday mornings. There was no cartoon channel. And I know I sound like grandma, but, and my brother and I would always get up and watch Fat Albert because it was a cartoon of Black characters, and then we'd watch all the other stuff. But really, there was no representation in anywhere for me, really, outside of sports. So, we had Muhammad Ali and all that, but in literature, those books that did exist were not part of our curriculum in school. I grew up in Ontario. They had segregation until the mid-60s. So someone my age was being taught by teachers who got their education in a segregated system and began working in a segregated system, right? So no, I don't even think it was a thought, really, at that time. Yeah.
I'll move to Courtney.
Yeah, the same thing for myself. I didn't think about representation when I was young because there really wasn't anything there. And I think when you don't have those examples in front of you, it's not something that you think of or start to develop those thoughts. As a child, the only representation I can think of is like the Indian princess and Peter Pan, or, later on, Pocahontas, again, the Disney representation. of, this love story when, this woman was actually, like raped and taken, like, and now it's made into this Disney film. So these romanticized ideas is what was the most present. But other than that, they're really, I had never thought of it because it wasn't in my face and it wasn't part of my life to see myself represented. Either Indigenous representation or queer representation, again, was all presented through a white lens growing up.
Eli?
Yeah, I guess for me, it was really dependent on where I was living. Because when I was living in Lebanon, most of the media that I was, other than like American media that I was consuming, most of it was, Arab media. And so that, made up a big part of like a chunk of my childhood. And when I moved back to Canada, probably when I was 11, things, kind of shifted drastically. And then representation in art and literature and media was, like few and far between, especially as like a queer kid. And I think it was, I would look for it in places that didn't exactly directly represent me, but I was like trying to find some connection. But in terms of like a kind of like any Arab on screen, other than like the terrorist, there wasn't really any kind of like real representation that you can kind of look to. So I think I also, similarly to you both, I wasn't exactly looking for it because I knew it wasn't really there. And so I was kind of trying to find my own ways of connecting.
Yep. And Shasta?
Yeah, I mean, I very much agree with everyone so far, so that's great. I think also like, I think naturally we try to find ourselves in things that we look at, that we read, that we come across, whether it's in human form or not. So, I always thought that I could find some aspect of myself, like in whatever I was like looking at or reading or absorbing, and as a way of just kind of finding myself, but not necessarily seeking to see myself on those screens or on those stages or in those books, because I wasn't really thinking in that way growing up, right? I don't think it was that, as the other panels have also said, so well, is that, these kinds of questions or issues weren't really at the forefront of the discussion, right? Or even the media. I just think the time that I was also born into, in the 80s and growing up in the 90s, like there's a certain thing of like, diversity, everything's all around, and this like neoliberalism. So I just never felt that there was a lacking of it. I just felt an overwhelm of what you could be. And then all the aspects of like what you couldn't be. And I think that was exhausting. So when I think about representation, I just kind of think about like, resisting it, or kind of seeing it as like a legal tender, or a way of like, what I mean? Like of being monetized or manipulative. So, I think a majority of how I think about that question is like, how did I avoid it? And also was overwhelmed by it, and also like resisted it and thought it was really fucked up to want to even be seen in those kinds of ways on those kinds of scales.
Okay. So you felt like you were almost being pushed into it, basically, that it was like,
yeah, as an aspect of like, exploiting you, or like, let's say if you're marginalized and you're on the outskirts of society, like I grew up in a very poor neighborhood, with working class parents, who are refugees. Like, I just kind of think like, any bringing attention towards you or focus or, seeing of you, it meant attracting more, problems or exploitation or whatever it is. So it wasn't the need to be seen or to be seen. It was like, why are we being seen and for what, right? And to what purpose?
Eli, I think I thought it was interesting coming from, because you moved to Lebanon, and then you had moved back. And so that, how jarring was it for you to come from like a very all, it was primarily, people that were like you being represented all the time, and then basically coming to a situation where there was almost nobody like you, or if they were like you, they were not something you were used to seeing.
Yeah, I mean, I like moved from Lebanon back to Canada into a very small white town, or like a small white city. So it was, I think I had been used to moving because we moved quite a lot as a kid, but it still was like quite jarring to come into a space where, I felt very alien. And I think, I'm like, in terms of someone who moved back, I'm like technically very like palatable to a large group of white people, but then being in a small town, like any kind of difference you have like sticks you out so completely. I think it's different if you live in a big city where, there are other people who might look like you, or other people who are racialized, or, immigrants, or different, or who, have an accent or whatever, which I guess I had when I had come back from Lebanon. And so, yeah, it definitely was quite jarring to come back and be like, what, now I have to kind of re-situate myself and re-figure out how to integrate into this group. And in some ways, I don't know, like being in that small town, I don't know if I ever did, because I was originally seen as, the outsider, and then kind of continued with the same people throughout my education as a kid and like as a teenager. And so I feel like I was like, it's like, oh, people knew this about me, so therefore that was always present, even when it was more subtle, I guess.
Blossom, you said in your bio you immigrated from Guyana.
Mhm.
How old were you? Do you have conscious memory of that time? And
I don't. I was a babe in arms. You know, almost 2 years old.
okay.
It was about 6 months after MLK was assassinated. So it was a huge difference. Looking back now, I can see I can only imagine how difficult it was for my parents, because they're going from Guyana, where they were allowed, my dad was permitted to have jobs, right, that could support his family, coming to a place where he wasn't permitted to do that because he's Black, right? So I can only imagine the kind of adjustment that my parents had to do. And we're not even talking about learning a new money system, because the bills aren't the same, right?
Mm.
Just learning what a five looks like in Canada compared to Guyana, or, dealing with winter and all that stuff that they had to do. But they also were, in the spot. And I think I was here so young that I didn't, and I don't have a memory of Guyana before I left. Like we did visit when I was a child, but that was my earliest memories, like years after we had left. And it's something, just going back to what some of the other panelists were saying about not seeing themselves represented and not knowing to look for it. If you ask a fish if the water's wet, what will the fish say? What's water? We're in this environment, and we don't know that we need to look for representation, authentic representation, not just seeing ourselves as criminals or what have you.
Mhm.
I think I got sidetracked from your question.
No, you responded. You responded
Okay.
well.
Thank you.
Courtney, you grew up on reserve, right? So was there so there might be a sort of slight difference in the sense that maybe was there a community media that existed that allowed you to at least have some sort of um, access to programming or literature, or even just media in general, that allowed you to have some connection?
I mean, after 1990, the Eastern Door newspaper in Ganawage had started. So again, that was really positive to have our own outlook on the media, because oftentimes I feel like Indigenous people, specifically our community, are misrepresented in the national media. Um, so that was something that was really positive. But growing up in my community is so different than being in the city, you know, like it really has a community feel. Everyone knew each other. You know, as children, you could just, you know, go anywhere in the community kind of thing. And then you come into the city and it's much more restrictive. So yeah, so again, that was just a different adjusting to city life instead of being back home. Um, and even going to you know, CEGEP in the city, and well, high school CEGEP, there was still no representation of Indigenous peoples or any mention of that when I was going to school. It only started in university. And also, you know, programming has changed so much now because there's a mandate to reflect Indigenous stories, and educators and students in universities. There's still a far way to go, but it has changed so much from the time that I was there. So I think that's, you know, that's really important that those changes are happening, you know, in the cities as well.
So, so all of you sort of, to varying degrees, well, maybe with the exception of Shaista, because you were kind of actively resisting it, but at some point, you know, for the rest of you, it was kind of like, you know, you were kind of in this vacuum of non-representation, and you felt like, you know, it kind of, it was what it was, sort of thing. When did it start really mattering to you to really seek out that kind of reflection of you and your community? I'll start with Courtney since you're muted.
Yeah. Again, for me, it started in university. I was at Concordia, and then I continued on to work in the School of Social Work at McGill University. And my mandate was always to support Indigenous students, create curriculum that supports our students, that brings in Indigenous knowledge from our communities, that brings students out to land in our communities. So creating these structures that just weren't in place. So that for me was very, very important. I think that's really where it started in educational institutions for me, and that I wanted to help support that change. Yeah, so that's where it started for me.
Who'd like to go next? Give the option. Okay, Blossom.
For me, I think it started, you know, in hindsight, when I was editing work, usually academic papers, I would always take out the colonial language. And I remember, and I know to say it this way because one of the authors had asked me, "Oh, that's a good change," or a change that I had made. And he said, "Why did you change that?" And I'm like, "Well, you know." And he's like, "Is it because it's more precise?" I'm like, "Well, no, what you wrote sounded really colonial. Like, that's not what was going on." He's like, "Oh, okay." And that's something that I continue to do, and I see myself doing over the books that I edit. And in terms of my own writing, it wasn't until my master's degree that I put it all together, that I was following the example that I had seen, you know, this idea that all of the characters are white unless they're described otherwise, you know, or, so that was something I did in my own writing. And reading Walter Mosley was really good. He has this murder mystery series, and he doesn't describe his Black characters as Black. He just describes them, and by the time you realize, like, I remember realizing partway through his, you know, the first book, oh my God, the main character is Black, and I was so happy. It was such a little thing, and he didn't just, you know, there was no chocolate colored skin or blah, blah, blah. It was just, this is the character, and you as the reader can determine your own image of this person, but then you get a clue that he's Black. So for me, those were the points that became, I realized.
Eli?
Yeah, similarly to Courtney, it was in university. I think it's kind of I think a lot of us, I mean, I think maybe now this is changing for younger people, but it was like the moment where I was able to kind of go out and do my own exploration and kind of think through my own ideas. And I was always really excited about literature and reading, and I only had either access through school to a lot of mostly white authors, and I was in a French school, so I did English literature, but also French in high school, and it was mostly white authors, or you'd have white authors writing Indigenous stories, and it was like a very singular, like this is who is allowed to write books, like white people, and they're allowed to write about whatever they want. And then I was reading kind of like classic white authors, because I was like, oh, for people who are interested in literature, that's what you do. You read all these like older authors from the 1800s or the 1900s. And so I was doing that in high school. And then only when I went to university and there were, different classes that allowed me to, like the special topics classes, which were like, and there were like some I was at Concordia, and there were, the Arab writing classes and Black literature classes, and, classes that had to be named as special topics, because then you could be like, oh, now we're allowed to could exclusively read a certain group of people, and like they are given importance. But I definitely had to look for those classes outside of the general classes that I had to, to do for my degree. And then I had this mini thesis that I was doing that you can kind of do in an undergrad through the creative writing program that I was doing. And I decided that year that I was going to exclusively read work by BIPOC. And I made my own syllabus, and I really curated, exclusively BIPOC and often queer, trans people. And it was just so great to just, spend those 6 months exclusively not reading white people, and kind of, reading work that I was really excited to be engaged with, and that was, kind of has then led to my current reading practices, and has changed the way I look at literature and think about literature, and who I want to engage with, who I want to give space in the world when I'm doing my own curation, or when I used to work at the bookstore, who I was trying to make sure that people read and thought about. And so I think, I just really had to kind of take it into my own hands, because there wasn't really anyone kind of giving me guidance through that, beyond, things I was reading on the internet and different conversations I was having with friends and stuff. But yeah.
Okay. And Shaista, when did you kind of maybe start thinking that maybe it was important for you to start, finding yourself reflected in the media?
I don't even know how, let's see, how do I say if it's important or not? I don't think it's a choice. To be perfectly honest, I don't think you have a choice to care about it or not care about it. I think it becomes like an extension of your identity, how you navigate the world, how you're able to survive, how you're able to make coin, how you're able to position yourself in relation to other people, whether you choose to or not. You are always contending with people's racial imaginary of who they think you are, what you need to represent, where you come from. So I don't necessarily think that it was like a choice that I made or realized. I think I just you know, you just kind of, you're imposed on those things for a long time. You know, people go, where is Afghanistan? Or, did, this whole, ideology that the women need to be saved, as if the women themselves don't have their own movements and their own political desires and ambitions and, activities that they've done long before any sort of Western attention or, intervention, quote unquote, was made. So, when did it become important? I think in my own work, I just try to ask these questions in terms of teasing it and confronting it and thinking about like, why is representation important, right? Like, what is this need to make visible what has been deemed invisible for a long time, right? Like, what happens when we give presence to something that has been absent for a long time, right? So these are questions that I guess maybe people in academia are very much well versed in. They live in that. I didn't go to school. So for me, it came from the experience of like growing up in neighborhoods where there's like not white people, right? I didn't encounter white people until I was 19 and started, working in the industry. And I was really like, wow, there's a shorthand and language that I do not know how to use. And now I have to learn that in order to represent myself and to advocate for myself and to do that. So, I think it's important. I think it's become important over time to use as a tool to wield. So you know how to like move through spaces. But I think I don't know. I think it's very dangerous to push people to become legible. And then legible to what degree, again, then to what end, and for whose purpose. I can tell you I'm Afghan. I can tell you, having Afghan people, on TV and in these stories are important, but then you also get fucking United States of Al, which is, a show about a goddamn US government with like a Petraeus, who is one of the consultants and like telling a story about an interpreter from Afghanistan who comes to America and is growing, being, kind of supported by this military American white family. It's disturbing as fuck. And I don't want to see that. I don't give a shit that exists on TV. I'm not like going like, yay, Afghans on screen. I'm like, holy, wow, that is like anxiety inducing for me to see that. And now I have to like work with my Afghan communities to address that, make a petition, all that stuff. And I'm like, I think people that actually work in conditions in which they're precarious and they're not having time to, think about what representation means for them. They're thinking about a living wage and how they survive, right? And I think that's where I get a little bit agitated as myself as being an artist and a working class artist and an artist that didn't go to school and was not versed in academia. Like I have a very strange experience of just being like, I'm invited to these things, I can be included to these things, but I know in reality, like people don't think in these ways. They think about how they're going to make rent,
I think that raises the question of that word authenticity, right? And which we've used in the title of this talk, but I mean that word is interpreted in so many ways by so many different people, and I guess I'd like to ask all of you, what you think of that word authenticity in applying it to representation and in terms of your own work and what you do. So I guess I'll just go back to you first, Shaista, because you so passionately talked about the kind of images you've been seeing, which is it's a good thing. So what's your take on that word authenticity?
Words don't mean anything, and yet they mean everything. They're so important. I think at the moment, like what is authenticity is like to be careful to, this goes into lots of things. So let me try to be as concise as I possibly can. One is to be careful to not consider authenticity as like an underdog narrative, right? Like how we count marginalization. Another aspect of authenticity is like, the kind of, paying dues, suffering, like victimhood. I think we have a myriad of different experiences that need to come to light, that need to have a more intricate, like, understanding of it that has to do with, you know, mentally, spiritually, and emotionally tackling these issues, and not just in a way of like talking about it in terms of the media or narrative, but on a more holistic level of like what this means to kind of focus on this word. But like I don't know, I think I think it depends, you know, who is called authentic, what is deemed authentic, and who are the interlocutors that get to choose how we categorize that authenticity. Is it chosen by community? Is it chosen by the culture? Is it self-chosen? You know what I mean? That you make that own choice for yourself to have that agency to say, I'm authentic, I have an authentic experience. So yeah, it's a very hard word for me because I really don't necessarily what it means, you know, to be perfectly honest. Ooh, that was my best answer. Sorry.
Okay. Anyone have another sort of take on that? Courtney?
I guess I'll go. You know, I feel the same way. That was so well said, because when I saw that, I'm like, authenticity, you know, how do you describe that? And I don't know. It's representation that matters. When we get into the words of authentic, then again, we all have different experiences. So what's authentic? You know, to my experience as an Indigenous person might not be for someone else. So they might not feel that story is authentic. But I think the most important thing, especially coming from Indigenous filmmaking, is that, you know, we're finally having this growth in Indigenous cinema now. And that's really great that there's different stories out there, that there's, you know, there's comedy, there's horror, there's documentaries, it's all happening. And I think that's what's really important, again, because we've been, you know, kept out of our own storytelling for so long, other people doing it. So we need, you know, especially in Canada here, funding comes from Canadian arts funding, production companies, and they really need to work with Indigenous filmmakers and build that community, and not just reach out to someone on a cold call. Hey, you're Indigenous, you know, do you want to come work on this? Like, to me, that's not sustainable, and that's not real relationship building to create a piece. I mean, for me, it's all about, you know, spending a lot of time on a project. Just like my last film, Married 2 Acts Early, I Am Indian Again. It's a short 30 minutes, but it was a 4-year process. You know, making sure that I was respecting and honoring Mary, who's from my community, Mohawk, but who's also passed away. So she can't speak for herself. So it's doing my due diligence to make sure that everything is as accurate as possible. You know, there's lots of information out there that's incorrect. So making sure, you know, I'm going through that, and also connecting with so many people across the country who worked alongside her, who were allies, speaking to her friends, community members, family, and seeing as many links that I could find while doing that, and then allowing people, participants of the film, to see the film. I think that's also a really important process when we're working with our own communities. And I might not know, I work on other Indigenous productions that I'm not from that community or culture. So it's really important for them to be able to see it, to make sure that I'm understanding correctly, that information was translated to me. So I think when we talk about authenticity, it's really about that care that we put in with the participants in our projects. I think is the thing that you can do the best to come to something that's authentic to a larger community.
Which makes me, like, just to interject very quickly, is like, that makes me really think, where like, is authenticity like a set of principles, values, integrity, right? Like, is it a process of accountability? Is that what we're talking about? Authenticity is not who has the right to represent, but it's like, is it fair representation? Yeah.
I have to agree. That's exactly what I was thinking, that for me, authenticity is linked to representation. is the representation authentic? You know, are we seeing the multiverse of our community? When I can only speak to books because that's the medium that I work with. Are we seeing the multiverse of characters who are Black? Or are they always the criminals? You know, and as a Black person, authentic representation is a matter of life and death for people of my community. I can only speak to the American statistics, but when we're talking about police shootings of Black people, when the officers are asked, why did you shoot? Their most frequent response is, I don't know. So if they're afraid for no reason, this person doesn't have a gun, but now they're dead. So if we keep allowing ourselves to be seen as the criminal, as violent, as aggressive, then that goes out into the media. It's not just us who are consuming that. The rest of society is consuming that. And society is made up of all different types of people who are doing all different types of jobs. So for me, authentic representation, having that multiverse of characters from, I'm going to say my community because that's the work I'm doing, but any community really, that will get out to, in film and in books, and people from our society would see that, and hopefully we won't have people saying, I don't know why I shot that person, down the road.
I think a number of you have raised a sort of interesting issue of this kind of racial lumping that happens, where everyone kind of takes Indigenous people as a category, and then all the sort of individual nations are kind of elided together into one. Same with Black communities, same with Middle Eastern communities as well. And I think it was interesting what you were talking about, Eli, in terms of like really focusing on sort of a vast array of BIPOC authors to read that weren't just Arab, but were sort of covered a panoply. Like for me, there was very little Asian representation, specifically Chinese, but even just sort of any East Asian representation in literature and media. So I would start turning to other kinds of authors, from other communities, from Black communities, and whatever was available in terms of Canadian literature anyway. So I'm wondering, like, I guess I'll start with you, Eli. Like, what was the first artist or artwork that really kind of spoke to you, regardless of whether they actually were, a member of your own community or not?
Well, I guess I can give two different answers for that. In terms of, for someone who I found who kind of really made a difference for me in terms of my writing and like as a poet was Trish Silla, who's a Lebanese mixed race Lebanese trans woman who lives in Toronto. And she's probably like 2 decades older than me, I would say. And it was really exciting to see another person who kind of had, is like actually in terms of identity is like quite close to mine. And who was doing really exciting experimental work that was thinking through the same ideas I was thinking through about, Lebanese and Arab identity and colonialism and, coming from refugee, like a family of refugees, but also like being settlers on Indigenous land and kind of thinking through all these like big ideas while also really thinking about form and poetry and trying to put it all together. And that was really exciting for me because I think, it kind of just gave me the like a possibility or something, you know? And I think in thinking about representation and authenticity and all these questions that you're asking, part of me, like everyone else, really rubs against these ideas, because I think there's like both sides of it, you know? I think it's really powerful to find someone who is like you or looks like you, who's doing something that you want to do, and seeing them as kind of, you know, an ancestor to you, and an ancestor who might not be a blood ancestor, but someone who you can, you know, make community with, or see yourself with, see yourself in. That's really powerful. And then there's this other side of it, and thinking about representation and authenticity, that I'm like kind of deviating from your question, but I'm interested in talking about authenticity, because what everyone was saying was really on par and like interesting, and kind of like fueling to my thought process, in terms of thinking about how, you know, only certain people are asked what authenticity means to them, and what it means to be authentic, and what it means to, you know, have authentic representations of themselves and of their communities. And some of us with, you know, multi layers of marginalization get asked that continuously for many different reasons, you know, like being a trans person, you definitely get asked about authenticity in a different way that I get asked about it in a racialized way. And I like really rub against the idea of authenticity, because I am more interested in ideas of like how you like choose to represent your communities, what the work that you try to do with them, what you try to, you know, do for yourself, and like the things that you yourself are interested in, and how, like, in, you know, as an example, like when I was writing my book, The Good Arabs, it talks a lot about Arab community and what it means to be Arab across many nations, and what it means to be in Canada as an Arab, and what it means to, you know, like be in community with other BIPOC, and like the ruptures that happen between different BIPOC due to colonialism and other, you know, factors and borders and all these things. And for me, what was important in writing that book wasn't that someone would be like, ah, yes, this is an authentic Arab story, you know, which kind of feels very like kind of Orientalist and weird, and really makes me feel like I have to be in like this little box of like what it looks like to be this type of person. But rather was like, I was like really interested in thinking through like how I would talk about these things while making sure that the conversation was, you know, open to a bunch of people, for people to be able to think about these ideas, for people to kind of like, especially Arabs, to really think about their own complacency in larger political structures. And I think, yeah, like writing those stories feels important to me, and like writing those poems and like thinking through those ideas feels way more important to me. And like community responsibility feels way more important to me than this idea of authenticity that really kind of, I don't know, you can like, it feels like this little top layer of something that you can just like shed away, you know, and like think actually what's beneath it, and what do we actually want to think about, and what do we actually want to, what kind of work do we want to do in our communities outside of like this white gaze of like what is authentic.
Does anyone else have someone in particular or a piece of artwork that they, there's another question I want to kind of go to with Eli's, but are there particular artists or piece of artwork that you first encountered that really sort of said, ha, you know, I feel seen? Blossom?
Toni Morrison's Critical Theories. Yeah, she was, she has this power in her writing where she doesn't tell you what the races of her characters are. So you have to figure out who's who, but she lets you know they're not the same race. So you have to figure out who's who based on your own bias, which is really a lovely exercise. You get to meet yourself, you know, and it's really interesting because she puts the onus on the reader. So that's her writing, but her critical, sorry, I'll get back to her critical theories. So in her writing, she puts the onus on the reader. So now you have to figure out where your bias lies. Like, where do you start putting people into a box about this is how this group should be behaving and looking and doing? And where do you allow people to show their humanity? Like, this is just a human experience, right? And something that Eli said that sort of triggered. Um, you know, certain people get asked certain questions. Like, I've been asked, are you an author or are you a Black author? Like, what do you consider yourself? But I have never heard a white author being asked, are they an author or a white author? As if that's not a race, or, and as, you know, as if they're not writing for a certain community. So it's really interesting who we let off and how we let them off. And, you know, once again, who are we putting in a box? And who are we just allowing to have express a human condition? Back to the critical theory. She's an amazing, oh, I don't even know where to begin. I'm overwhelmed just thinking about it. But if you ever have a chance to read her work, she does talk about race and the imaginary of what race does and how it's portrayed in movies and books. And she was a brilliant woman. Yeah.
Chase, you're unmuted, so I'm assuming you wanted to add something there. Because, in your case too, there's only been like one author who's really received a lot, from Afghanistan, or who's has an Afghan background, who's really, right? So, and then you talked about United States of Al, and so like, where did you manage to find someone or something?
I think that, what Blossom was also saying, just thinking about the works of Toni Morrison as well, but I'm thinking like so many of us who are, identify as people of color, have also been given language and understanding from, Black radical critical thinkers and writers, right? And I also think we haven't even come to in our own culture and time to even respect those works, and to give them the space that they need, or the legitimization that they need as well, for giving us the path to kind of have that understanding. So I think a lot of Black writers, like growing up, was my first kind of insight into recognizing what representation is, right? And the absolute dedication and the resiliency in writing yourself into existence, right? When I think about Octavia Butler, when I think about these kinds of writers that imagine these futurisms, but also to have the desire and want of a future despite the hostility and the oppression, right? And to boldly imagine in those ways, right? So I think that's one aspect. I'm like, yeah, and like we are still ways away from even acknowledging the paths that have come before us. And I'm talking about, for myself, like people that are, seen as like white passing. I hate that term, but I recognize its existence. I recognize who it benefits. And I go, there are certain privileges that have, and wording and language and understanding has been gifted to us by Indigenous and Black radical writers, that we have to take the time to acknowledge before we start formulating like even our own sort of viewpoints that really do come from those schools of thought. And I think what I have a hard time with is, like, regardless of who it is, whether, wherever you're from, that there's a lack of citation, a lack of respect for work that came before, historical amnesia. And I think when we don't put those things into context, when we're talking about representation, then representation becomes this like hollow, superficial exercise, right? Yeah, so that was my little addition to it. Thank you.
I'd like our students to remember that word citation because it's important. Courtney?
Yeah, I just also wanted to echo the sentiments that everyone said, that I really feel it is true too that, you know, our stories from our perspective should be seen as human stories and not necessarily categorized by, you know, our background or whatnot. I mean, if it's a good story, you know, immerse yourself in it, enjoy it. And I think that that's important because a lot of times it'll be put into another category or only play at some festivals, you know, because it's made by an Indigenous filmmaker or a Black filmmaker or whatnot. And again, representation on mainstream TV or movies, a lot of times when there is, you know, this one Indigenous character, it's so, you know, over the top, you know, with so many different stereotypes built into this person that it's not a real authentic human being. So I think that's, again, why it's important for our stories. I mean, I've been inspired by so much. I mean, part of it was the first time I went to the Imaginative Film Festival in Toronto back in 2007 or 8. I was there to write and cover the festival. And I think that was my first experience early on in getting into filmmaking, to meet, you know, all these filmmakers and producers and actors and be surrounded by, you know, this real community that wanted to make change. So I thought for me that was really important. And there's so many filmmakers out there that I think are really amazing, like Alex Lazarowicz. She did Fast Horse, which you can find online. Almaya Tailfeathers, Tasha Hubbard, Sonia Ballantyne, Trevor Soloway is currently working on a feature film. That's really exciting. And of course, you know, people like Alanisa Bombswin, who are a trailblazer and really paved the way for this current generation of filmmakers to be able to tell our stories. So I really have to have a lot of gratitude for her for creating that path.
Okay. So I'd like to sort of go back to something that Eli Tarek said about the idea of sort of doing right by our communities and the responsibility of that. And I guess what are the challenges of sort of representing your communities, I guess? And I say communities, not just because there's multiple of you, but you also have multiple communities, as we all do, you know, not just in terms of, you know, necessarily ethnicity or race, but also, you know, there's a few queer people on this panel. There's also, you know, trans, as Eli pointed out, and so, you know, and gender, of course. So what are the challenges of sort of taking on that responsibility, or do you feel like, you know, you necessarily need to take on that responsibility? So I see all of you sort of looking up thinking. So let's start with, well, Eli, I guess, because you were the one who kind of addressed that first.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it always depends on what I'm writing and what like to what end I'm writing something, you know. I think if I'm trying to write about big ideas, you know, like social, political, national, colonial ideas, or not, I'm not trying to write colonial ideas, but I think you get what I mean. Trying to write about these big things, I think there is a responsibility in writing about these things, and like what I choose to write and how I choose to be critical and who I choose to kind of whose work I choose to read to help me work through these ideas and this kind of thing. And I think there's a huge responsibility in that, but I think there's a responsibility in that, not in a representation sense, which I rub against, because I'm not trying to, you know, in writing this book called The Good Arabs, I'm not trying to write it as a positive representation of what Arabs are like, you know. And I think the title itself is kind of ironic because it pushes against that. But when I talk about responsibility, I'm talking about the responsibility towards my communities, towards a readership, towards myself as well, to write things that I actually want to write about, and not things that I feel like I have to write about in order to create work that will be sold, that will be pushed, that will be palatable to like a large audience, that will be palatable to publishers who will want to sell the work as part of like this like diversity move right now that is taking place in literature. That in some ways is great because I want to read many different types of people, but I think also there's like a way that a lot of it get like smushed into boxes, or like are allowed to be like are made to feel like we're allowed to be here because, oh, now people want to read about you, so now you're allowed to be here because you'll make us money, and I think I try to push against that and try to actually think about what storytelling means to me, what literature means to me. And for me, it is a conversation. It is thinking through work with other people, whether they're people who I've read or people who are in my community, and working through ideas, and also wanting to tell like compelling, interesting stories and compelling, interesting poems, like even that feels like part of the responsibility. But yeah, like and always like wanting to feel like my responsibility to myself is also important, like thinking about what I actually want to do, and whether I want to do it because I want more people to listen to me because of XYZ capitalist blah blah blah, or whether I'm like actually telling stories that I want to tell and hope that people read because they're interested.
Someone, sorry, does someone want to add to that? Blossom?
I think you see my arm moving to unmute and you call
Yeah,
me.
yeah, that's pretty much it. Add the cues.
Yeah, I've got to be more slick there. Eli, I have to say, you are very mature in your approach to your art. The project I'm working on right now, it started because I was really angry. I had gone to a exhibition at the Musée des Beaux-Arts à Montréal, the Montreal Museum of Fine Arts, and it was a group of Montreal artists who painted portraits, and they also painted group scenes of Montreal in the 1920s or so. And there wasn't a single Black person in the whole portraits. And I remember saying to the person I was with, wow, I guess Black people didn't live in Montreal in the 1920s. They did have one Indigenous representation, but that person wasn't allowed to be, they didn't have their name. All the other portraits had the name of the person, but not the Indigenous portrait, the portrait of the Indigenous lady. And then the history book review came out in Quebec. And once again, we see this whole erasure of many communities. Like they just did not exist in Quebec history. And I thought, oh my God. So the project I'm working on now is helping me work out that anger. And I'm looking at Black individuals who made, a huge contribution to Canada between, well, what's known as Canada now, between 1604 and 1917. So it's a bit research-based, research for scaffolding, and then I make this creative story about what their lives may have been like. But once again, it's not because I think it's going to, be picked up by a huge publisher or whatever. It's because it's just I didn't see it. There's no place where I can go and see all of these names in one place with a list of the reference books to find out more about them. So I'm creating it. I'm documenting what has gone before. I think I answered the question.
Okay. Shall you start, Courtney? To either Courtney?
Yeah. I think for me, filmmaking, I've definitely adapted as I've gone along. And one of the most important things for me is to really work very closely with the participants in my films. So I spend as much time, if we're not in the same city, on the phone, video chatting in the months leading up to us meeting, so that again we already have that connection, that relationship building going on, and so that it's not a shock or a new process for them. Like, I really like to talk through everything, and even everything about how they usually spend their day and what time they want to start. Like, I don't think it should be up to us, the filmmakers, to come in and take over their space and do it on our time. I think that's something that's really important, is to have those conversations together. And I think when I started out, learning from maybe a lot of the older journalistic documentary ways, were what people were suggesting to me, and it was just like, you have someone sign the waiver, and that's kind of it. And now they're obligated, and let's rush this, and we're in and out. And those things didn't sit well with me at all. And I was always thinking there's got to be a better way. And so I've been really fortunate to learn from other filmmakers around me, with ways that I feel comfortable, and that I feel like I'm really collaborating with the people that I'm involved with. And I think that's really important, again, because it's their story, it's their voice that's going to be heard. And for many people, it's the first time that they're in front of a camera. Like, these things just can't be rushed in order to go forward in a good way. And the other little challenge or thing that I work on is I'm trying to create, I've done some youth filmmaking workshops, trying to create, other workshops and programming for Indigenous people to learn about media arts, because there's so much talent out there. But how do we help prepare them to, get into the real world of filmmaking? And so I wanted to be able to create those opportunities for Indigenous youth or communities to learn about the different aspects of filmmaking, so that they have these opportunities to go out there.
Vesta?
I'm just loving hearing about Courtney's process as well, and just the absolute care and tending that needs to go into these processes. And I know that there's so many people across different industries and sectors that are really trying to insert that kind of care, so they're not, being, demanding and, imposing on the communities that they want to seek to represent and support. I think for me, it always goes back to, the burden and responsibility of creating this kind of programming, to understand where the lack is, and to give that, filling in of the lack, to give access points, right? And accessibility, like, that still falls on the most marginalized person in the room to figure out, while you have like people that are in positions of power or positions of stability or salaried roles, not doing that kind of labor themselves, but asking people to come in as like, a kind of a perpetual guest, to welcome these communities in these spaces, with no intention of like, operating in the long term with these communities, but to fulfill, some kind of programming, some kind of, lack that's there in their museum or gallery or institution, whatever it is, right? So I always, sometimes people will go, let's say if I'm part of a gallery show, they'll be like, we want your work to be accessible. Like, here are the other ways that you can make it accessible. And I go, cool, that's awesome. Now, where are my resources to make that possible? I'm already being paid shit Carfax fees. Thanks. And, and a lot of people get to go, do a lot of opportunities, or get to be programmed a lot, because they can afford to be paid little to be involved, to be a representative. So you also have to ask, like, what is their class location? What is their class background that lets them to advance, in their career, and to have some like careerist ambition? Their careerism and their representation is tied in hand in hand, right? So it's, you know, when I look at the burden and responsibility of representation, I go, one is the approach of like holistically, spiritually, you're not a careerist, maybe you're not making choices out of a sense of establishing a career, but you're making choices out of a need to survive. And rather than working at an Apple store for like wages that will pay you more as an artist, you'll want to have, be an artist because you think there's some kind of freedom associated with being an artist, but it's all more or less the same fucking poison, right? So, and then when I go back to the burden and responsibility, I'm like, there's been so many initiatives that I've done. Like I did BIPOC reviews for 6 years for the show The Archivist that's been touring. It was recreated by another Indigenous artist named Yolanda Bonal, and it got a lot of attention as well, even if I was doing that work for 6 years. And I go, because I've refused to take a lot of opportunities as an Afghan creator because I think that they are, they're white women, wanting to direct or produce me or to like lead me into a career. And I'm like, I don't need that kind of support. I just want to be able to exist and do my work and to figure out how we cope and survive in this world by doing this work. I don't necessarily need a savior, and I don't necessarily need to fit into these boxes, of palatability, in order to assure my survival. And it's like, when you refuse that, you get to a point where you really, really refuse to come into that, you experience another level of marginalization and isolation, and you still have to contend with the burden. If someone asks me to be part of the show or a gallery show or a thing, they're like, hey, who are you bringing from your community? Hey, who are the people that you've worked with? Like, and I'm like, cool, are you going to pay me for that additional labor that I'm going to do? And most of the time it's not. So it's like, I have, figuring out to what end do I make sure to advocate for my communities? Do they even want to be in those spaces? Do they even want to be part of this? Or is my access point saying that they want to be part of this for only me to get in? Right. So I have to really deliberately ask those questions. That means that I'm, I have to encounter far more precarity because I have to make certain choices so I can live in the least harmful way, knowing that I cannot escape capitalism.
Capitalism does seem to be a big issue, doesn't it? A big factor. Before we do have a couple of questions in the Q&A. I'll ask one final question, and that's the sort of the other side of representation, which is when other people kind of take on the representation for you that don't necessarily belong to your community. So the specter of cultural appropriation. We've had quite a few cases. I mean, there's always cases. I mean, it seems like the news always sort of circulates a never-ending sort of supply of stories about different aspects of cultural appropriation. But if I were to be specific, we had a recent incident where a filmmaker who claimed she was Indigenous turned out not to be, or it was questionable whether she was actually Indigenous. So Michelle Latimer, who some of you may have read about in the news, there have been, Adele in the past few months has worn Jamaican sort of outfits to celebrate Jamaican festival in the UK. And I guess the recent story has been that the film Dune, which has just come out, Denis Villeneuve's interpretation of it, has incorporated sort of Muslim and Middle Eastern imagery and language when none of the main characters are actually or main actors rather are of an Arab background or Muslim background. So I'm wondering how you feel about this. I mean, I can probably guess how you feel about the issue, but in terms of like in relation to being an artist, trying to make a living, trying to do right by yourself and maybe doing right by your community, and then having sort of these representations from other people, sort of posing as cultural appreciation, as that term gets bandied about. So I'm wondering what your feelings are on this particular issue before we get to the questions from the audience. So let's start with, okay, Eli.
I guess I just wanted to start it off by being like, I'm exhausted by people doing, like, I think the examples that you gave were like so different in each situation. Like we can kind of lump them together as like a vague cultural appropriation, but I think they have like different levels of harm in the like actions that were taken by different people. But I think for me, I just find it all very exhausting, and depending on whether it affects my community or, you know, like communities of like friends of mine or whatever, different levels of like annoyance, and then like sadness that people are, you know, on these wild trips that they're trying to take, and that they're trying to, you know, like a continuous like stealing of culture. But I'm just like, wish that, you know, I'm like, there's so much attention given to these people, you know, even after like, it's like, oh, well, someone did this thing that's like appropriative or harmful or violent, etc. And then let's like talk about them forever and ever and ever. And it circulates through the media, and it's like quite actually harmful for a lot of the communities who are like dealing with the violence of these mostly white people who are, you know, deciding that they can do whatever they want. And I think I'm so much more interested in talking about people that are doing interesting art, or are not being appropriative or not being violent in these ways. And I think as like the stories just kind of keep stacking on top of each other of people doing this kind of, you know, harmful bullshit, I'm just like, once again, we're giving people like so much attention. And I'm kind of just like, yes, like we should be talking about these things, and we should be talking about cultural appropriation and like cultural thievery and these kinds of violences. But I'm also like, having it be about a singular person who we take down feels like we're giving that person attention, and it's like part of like the media, like, you know, regurgitation, when actually it's not about a singular person. While that person was harmful, it's about a larger structure, and it's about a larger conversation that we should be having, and like what part of our culture allows these people to do what they're doing. So that's my rant.
Sure. Courtney, I think in particular with Indigenous, because there's been so much Indigenous sort of posing lately, and in this province in particular, it's become a very kind of weighted issue with people claiming Indigenous identity and all sorts of, you know, contexts. So what are your thoughts?
Well, I agree a lot with Eli completely.
Yeah.
And, you know, I mean, it is common across the country, and there's stories in academia. And, you know, at times I just think it's kind of wild when Indigenous people were always looked at as second-class citizens, but yet now there's this want, you know, from other people to claim being Indigenous. You know, for me, it's you know, you mentioned cultural appreciation earlier, and I think that's a really great word. And I think if people want to support works from, you know, different artists, and cultural appreciation is one way to do that. And if you ever have questions about, am I doing this in a thoughtful way, in a right way, you know, there's so many different organizations that you can reach out to, or if you know someone personally, because I think one thing as well is, you know, before you reach out to someone, question whether it's the person that you should be reaching out to. Should that person be doing this educational, emotional labor for you? That's why a lot of times organizations are a great place to start, to learn, to, you know, about the cultural appreciation you want to do. And yeah, just as Eli mentioned, I mean, these stories, you know, have created a lot of trauma in communities. You know, people who have worked with these people, trying to process, you know, what this means now with all of the effort that they put into supporting these people who turn out to be non-Indigenous. So I think, you know, that's really the best mindset that I have, is just always think about what you're doing. Is it cultural appreciation? Is it appropriation? and to ask about that. And if you're learning about your own culture for the first time, you know, that's really great too, but reach out to organizations to start that learning process before you know, claiming something and diving in saying I know. Take the time to learn.
Blossom or Shaista? Oh, okay. Shaista had her. She's unmuted actually. So
Would you like to go first, Blossom, or would you like me to? No? Okay. Well, one thing is that, you know, some of these figures are made into examples because I think shame also kind of, you know, perhaps plays an important role in our society in order to make people change, right? We have to become these shameful figures. They have to become like teaching figures for everyone else to be like, this is not what you're supposed to do. And sometimes I think, you know, celebrities are the easiest target because they're the most privileged, that we can really go in hard on them and just like keep regenerating content on them as well. But I think more than anything else, like, this responsibility that we have in representing, like I just remember at the beginning of my career, a lot of people were like, you should go to Afghanistan and get a research grant, you know, and spend time there and like make something there and then come back here and write about it. And I'm like, the fuck if I will, like, do you know what I mean? Like that, I have family there, but like my mom has been living there for 5 years. She was displaced the second time in her life. We just had to rehouse her, you know, coming from Kabul back to Toronto, back to Canada, you know, and just experiencing, I'm like, I have literal family there. There's been a lot of, you know, just a lot of demise, a lot of just horrible things that have been happening for a while. And, you know, especially with imperialism. And then I go like, this thing of, you know, sometimes people ask me like, do you think your work is going to help women in Afghanistan? You know, and revisiting that question over and over again by different people, no matter how many times, you know, the times of like years have progressed and we keep having these conversations. And I go, my responsibility isn't to represent people back home. My responsibility is to represent the experiences that I've had growing up here as a displaced person, as a child of refugees, as a working class person. My responsibility is to tell the story as honestly as possible about my own failures, my own biases. So it's like, you know, art can become some kind of form of modeling and accountability, right? Not as a way of positioning oneself as an expert or becoming the leader, you know, of a community, but more so as a way of like, wow, I'm so indoctrinated. This is what I was raised in, and it's going to take me a lifetime in my practice and in my personal life in order to deconstruct that, and it's going to haunt me for the rest of my life. And an aspect of that I wish to see more of, that I am seeing more of, so I'm not diminishing, but I wish to see more of like artists and thinkers failing and representing that failure, representing that tension, representing that confrontation, representing the shame that comes with associating. I feel like a lot of people, when they come into their identities, you know, before spending time with their communities, with these organizations, you know, building friendships, they go, I have this identity, it will give me access points, I will go in, but then they cause a great deal of harm because they haven't even spent time being that identity, living through that identity. But, you know, and it's just, it's that part that I'm struggling with, that I think the Canadian, you know, racial imaginary is just, it's too geared towards perfection and too geared towards expertise, that it dehumanizes this whole process of how, you know, confronting and difficult and healing it is to actually tackle these issues. It's not easy. I don't wish upon this kind of work on anyone. Once you decide to do this, like, you know, you're basically, you know, just destabilized in so many ways in your life.
Just riffing
So-
off of what
sorry.
Shaista said. Sorry.
Go ahead. Sorry, I
Oh.
realized my mic was off when I was speaking, but go ahead.
Okay. Just riffing off of what Shaista said. I think the racial imaginary in Canada is one of that. There's no problem. There's no racism. We're very welcoming. Everyone's equal and treated equitably. And that's not really the case. And, you know, you were talking about appropriation, Alan, and, you know, I kept thinking, you know, as people were speaking, like, you know, with this use of Black vernacular or imitating rappers, and that there's this expression, everybody wants to be Black until the police show up. So if you're not comfortable having that behavior in every possible social experience, don't do it. Like, it's not you, obviously. And I really like the term of cultural appreciation. And that's something I still need to sit with and think about, and perhaps learn how to incorporate. Because if I'm being honest, in my longer pieces, in my books, the villains are usually white. So I really I need to maybe show a little bit more grace. Yeah, instead of just flipping the narrative.
Okay. Now I guess we'll turn to some questions from the audience. I'm not sure how answerable one of them is, but I'll start with the first one. It's a three-parter. So why is it so important? I mean, some of these may have been addressed already to a certain degree, but why is it so important to represent your community? If so, then why is representation only subjective to the ethnicity or the place of origin? Does the authenticity of expression cover all of humanity? So does anyone want to take that?
Yeah, I'll
Okay.
try.
Okay.
I think we've all answered this, these questions in so many different ways over the time that we've had together. So, but I also think, like, okay, there's the proliferation of the message, right, is important. Like, sometimes you're not trying to represent your community, but you're trying to represent that something is at stake, something is in danger, right? So you have to, become the voice of, one of the many voices, right, to keep having people's attention on a cause or an issue, right? So it doesn't become about yourself. It becomes, how do I act in service of what needs to be addressed and what needs to be seen? And I have to be able to utilize my voice and where I'm at, and if I have some privilege or access or whatever it is, to use that in the graces of that, right? So I always feel that's still important. So if there's an issue about Afghanistan, if there's an issue in Haiti, I'm still gonna speak up, like, no matter what, and try to proliferate it. But it's very alarming for me too. And I think often, like, even in data management, where I go, even if you're doing something to voice something on these platforms, someone else is monetizing off your expression of being one of these voices, and they're actually one of the oppressors. So that's the other thing that I get really, confused by and really confronted by all the time, is like, how much do I use my voice? Where do I use my voice? Who gets the benefit of, bringing this voice? But also, I can't stop, doing that, because if I stop doing that, then it just, gets invisibilized.
Also, just kind of looking at the question again, I think also maybe what they're asking is in terms of being specific to your community versus the universality of your work. I guess the quote unquote universality. Blossom?
That seems to separate the idea that people of my community don't have the universality of humanity. Right? So being authentic, having authentic representation of people in my community actually is an expression of the universality of humanity, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think that's very well put. Courtney or Eli, do you have anything you want to say? No? Okay. If anyone else has a question too, we probably could. Oh yeah, Shaista.
This is like one more thing though, but this is the thing that I get really stuck on still, is like, why am I fighting to represent? Like, why aren't we teaching people to represent themselves? Why aren't we teaching people to have access points? Why aren't we teaching people their own, way of speaking in their own way, like for themselves. Like, I don't need to speak for people. I love to be in a position of helping people empower people to speak for themselves, because it makes it stronger, right? Like it would become a very weak point if it was just me right now. If there's like 20 of me, it'd be even, it'd be harder to contend with us, right? It's versus one.
I don't know if you guys can answer the second question because it's on music specifically, but I'll ask it anyway if anyone wants to jump in. Do you believe there's a lack of representation for non-white artists in the music industry, especially when it comes to any genre that is not hip hop? For example, the world's biggest non-rap artists are white: Adele, Taylor Swift, Madonna, etc. Do you believe that there is a lack of representation that comes from a lack of interest from the general public? Does anyone have sort of a general opinion on music? Eli?
Well, it's not specifically about music, but I think just in terms of like what I know about literature as well, that there's an imagined audience and then there's the real audience. There was like a study I think done in the States was like thinking about who the biggest audience of contemporary literature is, and the assumption was that it was white women, but it's actually Black women that make up a very large portion of an audience who is, buying books and stuff. And so I think there is what we get, I think when it comes to money and marketing and like the big, like producers and disseminators of art and music and all these things, there's an assumption that is based in, all the stuff that we've been talking about of like who it is that's actually accessing art and accessing music. And then there's the reality of it, and that doesn't always match. But then, these people, certain like kind of white artists get like given attention, and then they're put on the forefront and they're allowed to make mistakes and they're allowed to be mediocre and they're allowed to do this and continue on in the forefront while everyone else has to work 6 times as hard. And so then there's also that, which becomes like a lack of access, for people who aren't able to move through mediocrity and continue to succeed.
Okay. Mediocrity is a good word. Do we have any other thoughts before? We don't have any other questions. So any other thoughts, closing thoughts before we end the session? Okay. I'd like to thank our panelists for their participation in this very enlightening discussion. A lot to think about, I think, for our students and for those who